the Prime Minister to deliver a 7-minute speech on the motion that stands in his name for our final round. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Sometimes, back in the Wild West, criminals were running rampant, lawmen were corrupt, and infrastructure was slow to develop to account for these problems. The only thing they were able to do was send out a Lone Ranger and put a bullet between the man's head. We think this is a reasonable way to address international politics based off of what's happening with the growing infrastructure in today's modern world. What Rhett and I are going to do today is create kind of a magical system that is going to go and do this. But then we're also going to talk about why essentially international prosecution is ineffective, right? And then talking about how to cut off organizations' heads and how to decrease those hierarchies, right, before they can grow further, and why we think that's important for justice and for peace processes to develop further. Reasonable things, we think. So first, a fun moment, right? Because Rhett and I had a lot of fun with this. So basically, we're creating this new system, more or less. We're going to create this idea called the Black Court, really, really big on it, right? It's going to be lodged within the UN. And so what it is, it's going to be basically a group of people coming in within the UN to decide on crimes against humanity. What do we mean by crimes against humanity, right? Well, we generally mean things like the Geneva Conventions, right? We're talking about genocide, war crimes, experimentation on humans, those kinds of things. We think that those are clear. But when we're talking about the specific nature of them, we're going to talk about them being open, right? So things that are known by the international population, right? Things that are blatantly open that we know are happening, right? So we can look towards examples of Charles Taylor and warlordism. We can look to Slobodan Milosevic and the genocide of the Albanians, right? We can look at Joseph Kony and the conscription of children in war, those kinds of things which we actively know are happening, right? And we are able to prove, and we have an international consensus that says these things are happening, right? We don't necessarily know, maybe they're happening, maybe they're not happening, right? We're very clear on trying to make that kind of justification. So that we bring greater legitimacy to these kinds of assassinations. So what we're talking about, right, is Slobodan Milosevic, right, Kony 2012, Dick Cheney, George Bush, right, those kinds of people, right, and moving forward with that kind of international prosecution. So let's talk about what international prosecution looks like in the status quo, because that's kind of important, right? So the main mechanisms which we have in dealing with these kinds of crimes against humanities, right, is the International Criminal Court. Right, and so what we see right now happening within the International Criminal Court are a couple things. Sure.
So which states, which armies, which people are carrying out the assassinations? Because the bullet has to come from somewhere.
SEAL Team 8 created by the UN. I don't know, right? That's pretty much it, right? You could they'd probably be an amalgamation of people, right? But sorry. No, not this one. So, yeah, SEAL Team 8, whatever, or 9, 10, 11, 12. So going forward in this kind of international prosecution, right, what does the ICC actually look like, and what is it actually accomplishing in today's modern world, right? So what we see is, first and foremost, that they are not targeting the correct kind of people, right? We see that it's kind of largely almost racist. It's very much targeting African people. It's not necessarily targeting the global context of international crimes that are happening around the world. So we think that's important to address. But more importantly, we don't think it's necessarily effective in trying to address the means of it, right? Because these kinds of trials end up going on for years and years and years. And sometimes, in certain cases, they don't actually bring any sort of type of justice to these situations. Because what we see is these people, the people that are affected by these crimes against humanity want a swift and kind of swift justice that we think is most important in trying to reprimand these crimes against humanity. So what we see is that the ICC basically influencing the political power to try and introduce this Western form of justice, this Western concept of justice. It only holds up the process that we need to give these people a fair trial, that we don't necessarily even know if we're always going to get a current conviction, even when we know that these crimes against humanity are blatant and we know that they have happened. We think that it's most important that there is some sort of efficacy outcome, right? And insofar as the trial takes so long to accomplish, right, and those kinds of things aren't happening, right, we think that you're actually excluding justice from those people that are harmed by those crimes against humanity.
Do you not think that unilateral action by the UN carried out by unknown decision makers will be perceived as more Western and will also be less accountable at the same time?
So possibly, right? But what we think within this is that there is at least an international body, right, between this that is discussing these kinds of things, that we can have some sort of thing. We think that this is a better actor to deal with rather than saying the United States or NATO, that they at least have the capacity to get these kinds of conversations going. Yeah, basically that's where we're going with this. So more importantly, though, when we're talking about why assassinate these things, right? Because that's also important to address in this conversation. Is that we think that assassination is important because, in principle, you are able to cut off the head of an organization, in principle, before it could potentially do more harm, right? So we think that it's particularly helpful, right? Because when we know that certain crimes against humanity are ongoing, right? Like the Albanian genocide that is ongoing, that is happening for several months. We think that when you essentially put a bullet through Milosevic's head, right, you are able to not only make a political statement that says this is wrong, right, but you're able to further disincentivize other people from wanting to get involved in this, right? So if we know actively that we will take action against people who are committing open crimes against humanity, right? We think this basically inhibits the basic deterrence argument, right? That it deters people from wanting to commit these crimes against humanity because we know that there will be action to this, right? So if you know that, oh, well, I can just go kill 800,000 Albanians, right? And oh, well, maybe I'll just be in the ICC for 8 years. You're like, oh, well, that's not that bad, and maybe they won't even convict me, right? It only encourages people to do and commit those kinds of crimes against humanity even further. We think that that's important in trying to address this because we think that, in terms of this warlordism that's happening, right, that people don't actually think about, they actually know the potential consequences of this, and by doing that, they actually still make these terrible decisions and still keep them going from happening. What we also think is that it also increases the speed at which we are able to get rid of this organization, right? So if you are able to take off the top head of this organization, we think that hierarchically, the structure will also break down, right? And that's very important because in terms of we want to be able to punish the leadership of these organizations, and by sending that kind of message such as you will be assassinated, right? It sends a very clear political message that we don't necessarily agree with this, and it's very swift action that actually has an outcome. So basically what I told you today is creating this magical kind of court, I guess, more or less. But more importantly, right, the effectiveness of the ICC is not in a way that's actually bringing any type of justice forward, but more importantly, we're very concerned about cutting off the head. Rhett is going to bring you more ideas about justice within the international realm, and we are proud to propose today.
We thank the Prime Minister for his speech and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to introduce the opposition line. Hear, hear.
Yeah.
So, just because you get a really fun motion in a final round doesn't mean you get to ignore the realities of the world in which your motion exists.
Shame.
And as much as I would like to be on that side of the magic system in which the United Nations agrees on a new SEAL team and assassinates dictators and other warlords, we obviously have a few issues. And I hate to be the Buzz Killington of the round, but we're going to have to break this down a little bit. So, I find it funny, first of all, that we hate prosecution and what it represents so much, and yet we're naming this a black court in some sort of sense of taking the prosecution ground for ourselves. But okay, 5 points of refutation. First, he tells you that these are cases in which it is clear and obvious to everyone that there has been an egregious violation of human rights. One of the problems and one of the difficulties that the ICC has found is it's very difficult to get a large number of actors to all agree that someone has committed a serious violation of human rights. Like, there are still people who deny that the Holocaust happened. There are still people who don't think massacres were that bad because they hold the ideology by which the massacre was enacted. So we think we're going to have a lot of difficulty in getting a large number of actors to all agree that these people have to die. Secondly, He says that there's a problem with the ICC. It's not targeting the correct kind of people, right? Like it's racist towards Africa. Okay, so that doesn't mean we abandon it. That doesn't mean it can't start targeting the right kind of people. It just means we haven't found the right kind of people yet, right? Like we haven't pursued the right kind of people, if that's the case. But the same reasons that the ICC has trouble targeting the right kind of people are still harms that you're going to have under your side of the house, right? You don't avoid this. This is still a system of prosecution. It's just without a court, right? You're just deciding the sentence preemptively. Thirdly, the idea that there's a Western concept of justice with the ICC versus the apparently universal concept of justice that you kill someone and you have the moral high ground. But otherwise than that, we hear already from bottom half of opposition, thanks for stealing this point, guys, that the actor being the UN can be perceived as extremely Western, right? Like just because it represents a lot of nations doesn't mean that people don't think, maybe rightly, that Western powers have most of the influence there. And so we worry about not only the decision-making process, but the way that its actions are interpreted. Fourth point of refutation. The idea that we cut off the key actor or the key leader before they can do any more harm. A couple problems with this. First, it's often hard to identify who is actually the main perpetrator of a massacre or of a human rights abuse. Like in Rwanda, they arrested 200,000 Hutus as all being perpetrators of the massacre, right? But secondly, we think that people will come up and fill this spot that it's now opened by the leader. Why? Because sometimes the threat of death is not enough to deter ideological actors that don't have any incentive to care about the fact that they're going to die, because their goal is more important than that. The threat of death doesn't just stop everything from happening, guys. And you also, we think, fifthly, because he tells you it's going to send a clear message, no one's gonna like rise up again, right? Because they know the threat of death is there. No, they're gonna see someone who got killed. They might not really understand the message, first of all. But secondly, even if they do, all they're going to interpret that as is that he was too open, he was too able to be shot. We're just going to hole ourselves in even more and make sure that this doesn't happen again. These are all problems they have to resolve. I'm sure Red is going to have a great time with it. Okay, so a couple points that I'm going to bring you today. First, we're going to talk about significant things that happen with this policy and ways that it damages the international community. And second, we will talk about why we do prefer international prosecution. And I don't really care that the ICC hasn't prosecuted enough people yet. I think it's a great system, and we'll talk about why. Okay, so first, what happens with this policy? We're ignoring the idea that this policy can fail, right? Like, we tried to kill Fidel Castro, 100 times when we weren't able to? I mean, maybe SEAL Team 9 is just really, really good at what they do. But there is a possibility. We'll branch it out, guys. But there is a serious chance that you fail, in which case you embolden that leader even more. You tell him that he has presented himself as a threat to the international community and that his moral crusade that he perceives as being something that needs to happen, and the power that you grant him in that message is huge. You give him fame among the international community. We don't like that. Go for it.
Do you have the power then to arrest somebody who might be in the middle of a war, right, committing those acts of genocide?
Not always, right? But what we tell you is the assassination attempt or the assassination effort is so much worse within those circumstances. Further, you have to wait till the war is over usually to get people to agree that crimes against humanity have actually happened, because you have to wait for things to come out and information to get there. So we don't think we're talking about wartime scenarios. We're talking about after the fact. No thanks. If it is successful, though, you end up with a serious power vacuum, because oftentimes these are leaders of countries. By the time that we've decided a massacre took place, these people were already previous leaders, or they become leaders after the fact. Oftentimes, the next people to take power are going to aggressively pursue violence against the people who committed acts against them when there is no international mediator there, right? So in Rwanda, when the Tutsis took power with Paul Kagame, afterwards, they enacted this harsh system of justice against hundreds of thousands of Hutus, locking them up and just pushing them through the court systems and either arresting, convicting, and executing them. And in Kenya, if we agree that there were severe crimes against humanity after the elections, as the ICC agrees, we're talking about assassinating the president of Kenya, right? These are people that actually have to be talked about. It's not just these nebulous leaders within a wartime that we all agree are awful and terrible. These are actual leaders of countries sometimes. We can't really see how that's going to be beneficial. But we think it also increases animosity between states, even if it's effective, right? Because we have this problem with Western hegemony and how the UN is interpreted. We have the problem with how Latin America America has a great history of the US coming in and assassinating their dictators. If we decide we have to do it again, how do we think they're going to respond? How do they perceive that message? We don't think they perceive it extremely well. Okay, and we have to deal with the fact that people within the country might actually support this individual, and you're not going to have this like large amount of support against them. Okay, secondly, why do we prefer international prosecution? When a collective body comes together to all agree that an individual has committed an egregious offense, and they take the moral high ground, that holds extreme moral weight, not just for those countries, but for the people affected by those crimes. We lose that moral credibility when we take the same means that we disagree with, which is violence, which is killing, to take out and solve that problem of getting rid of that leader. When we choose the ICC, we send a message of hope to the victims that were affected by these crimes, because we tell them that your rights are going to be respected. The crimes against you are going to be talked about. There is closure and there is credibility within this. It allows for a peaceful process that ultimately guarantees a better long-term outcome for that group of people or for that state. We agree that sometimes or all the time, what these individuals do is awful. What we tell you is that in almost any circumstance, in all the circumstances we've talked about, assassination would be much, much worse. We oppose.
We thank the leader of the opposition for his speech and now calls upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate for open government. Here.
I've got finals in like 2 days, Calvin. You're no fun. So, Adolf Hitler walks into a bar and is killed by drone strike. War over, America and Canada goes home and has a beer. Solved. We're here today to bring you the fact that we think our version of awesome robot vigilante justice will be more effective, one, in stopping the sort of crimes that we're talking about on both sides of the aisle and actually bringing the sort of like hope to victims from perpetrations that Calvin's been talking about much more quickly and effectively than basically anything else that we've seen so far. And two, will be awesome. So I'm going to talk about a few things of refutation, on some of the things that Calvin said, and just backing up a few of my partner Jacob's points, just to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of justice for all, and this idea of why, essentially, like international vigilante justice, we actually think might create a better international community, or at least more faith in these sorts of institutions as being at least effective. So, first of all, just a few things that Calvin talked about. First of all, he talks about how like we can't get actors to agree in the status quo about like who's committed, crimes against humanity, etc., and we won't be able to in the future. Now, a lot of times people who resist like designations of crimes against humanity for certain people are doing so for largely political reasons. Like, this is your ally, you can't go back on them now, even if they're kind of like a fascist, and you're like, that was terrible, but like we obviously have shared interests. Like, you don't want to actually do these sorts of things. Like, there are very complex political reasons for why on face you might say certain things, when even if privately we think these beliefs are often held where you're like, no, but seriously, that guy's a psychopath. We think that issue is probably not an issue for a black court that meets in secret and all has robes. Like, you don't actually think that they have to care about like the complex political reasons that your country, like America, cares about, whatever country has done something just because we like them better than somebody else does. Like, you don't have to take those considerations into account. You only have to consider whether or not the person appears to have killed just a whole lot of people. And if so, dealt with. Problem over. Back at
You're really oversimplifying the issue, right? You're skipping straight to the conclusion. It's really hard to be able to tell that these people definitely killed a lot of people, right?
I think that usually it's pretty obvious when large amounts of people die. It's not like you can hide a genocide and be like, no, police, come back with a warrant. I don't have any thousands of bodies in mass murder. Usually speaking, it's not actually like super difficult to be able to get at least a reasonable amount of evidence to carry out these sorts of attacks. And we generally think that most of the people who are found guilty and judged thusly will probably be so. We get this idea that like the threat of death doesn't stop these people. Yeah, you know what does though? Death. Like, it might be an issue like at first, but like after like 4 heads of whatever organization this is died in a week, guy number 5 is like, actually I think I'd like to go back to being a janitor. Like, I don't want to be involved with this anymore. We think that's ultimately good. It might be an issue at first where they're like, we don't actually believe the UN will do this. But then once it's become extremely, extremely clear that the UN's gone off the rails, I think they'll stop making terrible decisions. We think that in the future this will be solved and we'll probably have to blow up fewer people. We might fail to kill the person and they'll just feel emboldened. That's just as true if we're prosecuting them. Like, we might fail to actually prosecute them successfully. And in fact, based on the evidence, we almost certainly will. When you're talking about killing people by Sky Robot or SEAL Team whatever, our, like, hit ratio is actually really awesome. Like, we usually get the people we're actually going after, just generally speaking. So we don't think that'll be as big of a problem. Secondly, you have to wait until the war is over to find out these issues. I mean, you might, Calvin, but the Black Court does not and doesn't take it. Oh gosh. Taking the moral high ground whole thing that's important for legitimacy, it's only important if you actually get these people, right? Like, it's only important for the legitimacy and bring this sort of restorative justice and hope to the people who are actually effective if you're actually able to, within the international context, actually get everyone to agree, I'll take you in a second, actually get this person brought in, actually get them charged, and actually punish them. That happens in an incredibly small minority of cases. The mass majority drag on and on and on and on and on and on, where the person's allowed to live in their mansion or house on a hill or wherever, even in exile in some other country where they're living relatively in much better conditions than whatever their victims are left with. We think that's abhorrent, and we think that this system is much more efficient in dealing with these problems. Please.
Let's talk efficiency. Back in 2001, the United States of America proudly declared that they wanted Osama bin Laden dead. How long did it take for that to happen?
Okay, did George Bush really want Osama bin Laden dead? Or did he just want to skip to Iraq? Listen, we could have gotten George Bush and Osama bin Laden with one UN Black Court and solved all of these problems immediately. Oh, it would have been so cool. Okay, justice for everybody. So I want to get behind this idea that we want to unite. We want to try and instill this idea of global human rights and of things that, yes, certain things are crimes against humanity. All humanity. Like, this is so egregious that as a species, we're like, no, this just can't happen. And we think that there are certain values that go beyond Western, like, values, that go beyond these sorts of, like, very limited ethnocentric scopes that I think most people could agree with. I think genocide is probably one of those. I think we could probably get everyone on board on these sorts of things. And I think it's important that we unite people behind these sorts of, international institutions and international problems in a world of increasing globalization, right? Like, everyone hates war criminals and probably wants to see a stop to them. But the problem we have is that people struggle right now with these international institutions. People laugh whenever the UN is brought up in a debate round for the exact same reason every time. They don't seem to do anything. They don't seem to solve anything. They do too much hand-wringing about what's legal and what's not psychotic. We think that instead we ought to focus on actually solving the problems, even if it might go past what we consider careful legal jurisprudence and wander into this area of sort of vigilante justice. Because frankly, we would rather that these tools be viewed as effective, if weird, than ineffective and totally useless and easy to be ignored. We would rather that people sort of engage in this essential appeal to populism where you're like, yeah, we got that guy. It's all over the news. He was a terrible person and now he's dead. I think that most people around the world could rally behind that as a concept. I think that most people would have greater faith in these international institutions, in things like the United Nations, if we could prove that they were actually effective at stopping conflict and at dealing with things swiftly. And I don't really care if a bunch of, like, psychotic genocide committers get blown up by robot death strikes for that to happen, and if they complain that they had insufficient amount of time to defend themselves in court and they really, really wanted an appeal. Like, we think that's something that we're willing to sacrifice for the greater good of global justice, for the greater good of bringing the sort of restorative justice he's talking about, and for restoring faith in these international institutions as effective actors within the modern political context. For those reasons, my partner and I are proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the debate for opening opposition.
So, if you look at the James Bond world presented to you by side government here, where you're able to just swoop in easily, take out the organization's head leader, and everything just crumbles and peace turns to the region, you walk off in the distance with a good girl. Great. If you believe it's going to happen and you have the efficacy on their side, then I think they're really missing the real world situation we live in today and how most of what they're saying doesn't really hold. Most of what they're saying doesn't meet the ends for which they would have you believe. So I'm going to talk to you today about one major point that I'm going to break into two different sections. So the long-term future, if we go with this really horrible plan being set forth by government, and that's going to play out in efficacy and how it's going to entrench instability in whatever region this happens in, because nothing good can come from this. So, but first I want to get into some refutation. He's talking about how, you know, people can't just hide and say, come back with a warrant. There's no bodies here. We think that there are attempts to hide things. In Cambodia, after that massacre happened, there were huge trenches mass graves dug, people were hidden, and they tried to cover that up. There is attempts by these people. They're not just going to be like, you know what, I'm going to flaunt the fact that I killed a bunch of people, genocide, come at me, drones. You think that there is like an actual attempt to hide things here, and it's not just like this open thing where you know all the facts as side government would have you believe. And furthermore, he says the motivations of these people will change. They will no longer want to commit genocides because there's going to be this, like, someone could kill them. Someone could kill them now. I'm sure they have, like, enemies in that country. But what we see is the methods don't change. The methods, or the motivations don't change, the methods do change. The methods become more secretive. The methods become better to hide. The methods become more, like, enclosed. We're going to actually commit these crimes and hide ourselves in and be more well protected. And so it actually becomes harder to meet the end goal that they would have you believe. It becomes harder to use these drone strikes to the SEAL Team A. There's some, like, magical, like, unicorn people who can walk through walls and just assassinate these people and walk out and everything's hunky-dory and it happens, like, really soon. We don't think it's going to happen. And so furthermore, he's saying, you know, global rights, we need to have them. Genocide is bad, so we're going to kill them. Like, we think that that's not the way to go about things. We think that there are, like, really clear ways that processes of criminal justice work, and they bring more closure to victims' families. They bring more, like, stability in the region and long-term facts. We see that, you know, victims aren't going to want to see, you know what, he terrorized my family and killed my friends for years and he's dead. I want to see him rot in jail. I want to see him brought to justice by an international community, recognized as a violent person by the international community, and not just like get the option of being taken out by a drone and just like one like simple like fact ending his reign of terror. And we see that like that's not really a legitimate means for like the victims in this situation. And furthermore, we should never like go through extreme measures because a populace says so. Because Coney 2012 took off on Facebook, we're gonna go kill him. We think that we need to have like more of like a system in place and more of like checks and balances than just if there's like a genocide happening and a bunch of people are like supporting it, so it, like you know not everyone's going to support it. There's that case that Calvin brought to you too. We're just gonna go kill them and everything's gonna be fine. We think that's ridiculous. So into my long-term future, efficacy. What happens like when this does become the thing? I talked about methods. Violence is going to get worse. These people aren't just going to take it sitting down and stop what they're doing. They're continuing what they're going to do. That there's going to be like rebellion. And furthermore, most of these organizations have a Hydra structure. Like I highly doubt you're going to like take out the head of the leader. It's going to crumble. Something else is going to come in its place, especially when you're going in, swooping, killing them, and leaving. There's no long-term like stability there. And what we see is they give us this whole idea that it's easy to swoop in and do this. I think like back half by brilliant POI. Yeah, we've tried this before. It didn't really work out. It took forever and it was violent and a lot of people died. Back half.
Okay, so you just said that they have a Hydra structure, so they have like leaders in place. But then Calvin came up before and said, if you do kill off the leader, there's going to be a power vacuum. Like, which one is it?
There is a power vacuum because it could be like another person comes up in that organization or a different organization swoops in. It just depends on like the regional. It's different per region. So what we see is like we see that there are like different situations where like it's not going to necessarily be better. You don't actually guarantee a better stability. We think that either way, whether a different organization swoops in this power vacuum or if the same organization swoops back up, we don't want that either way. We want like a long-term plan that's going to help this, but not like bad stability in the region. So, and furthermore, like we think that when you do just like kill off the head of these people, you swoop in and take them out, we don't have any insight into their motives. We don't have any insight to any other information they might have. We actually take away like a big venue of like long-term talking to them, long-term like interrogation, finding out, hey, this is what's really happening, and like we're just kind of like cutting off that source of information. And just because like the leaders are going to be cut off doesn't mean that that coercion and that instability and that violence in that region is going to stop. So instability entrenches them. Families are torn apart, and in the aftermath of this, the cooperation of people is what we need to make organic change. We need the cooperation of the people and the backing and the support of the people in that region if we want to see any long-term stability, if we want to see any long-term government arise out of this. We don't want to just swoop in and swoop out, just like some like the eagle taking like Frodo to the mountain. He can just swoop in, take him, throw the ring away, and it'll crawl out. Everything's hunky-dory and fine. We don't think that happens in real life. Yes.
So those countries which you're talking about don't actually have the jurisdiction over those cases. Those leaders go to the ICC. Those countries don't actually have any influence over those cases, right? So if they aren't actually proved, right, how do you have any sort of justice?
So if you're saying these cases aren't actually proven, we have no sort of justice, we think it's better to go through like checks and balances and a process and actually go through and look into things before. If you're saying you can't know and you want to go in there and kill them, that's a problem. Like if you're telling us that you can't know and have all the insight, but your end solution is, well, we're just going to shoot them in the face with drone strikes by this magical SEAL Team 8. We think that's ridiculous, and we think that you're actually like ruining your own efficacy here. So, and what we see is like, most of these regions where this happens, if we don't have this organic change, we're not going to have like long-term stability. And what's that going to do to that nation? It dooms them to chaos. It dooms them to be in a situation where they are unable to come in and like their leader's just been shot and everything's gone. We're not going to have these venues in place for the people to actually like have like a better life and a better situation for them to arise. And what we see is that's very, very damaging, because what we do is we're going to, obviously where places are happening, it's already in a weak government, where there's been a power structure where people are able to swoop in and create these egregious things happening. We're not creating a magically strong government by cutting off the head. All we're doing is making a weak government chaotic, and what are we going to do now? He's gone, I'm going to go for power, I'm going to go for power, I'm going to do this. You know, we think that we don't have any efficacy here. We actually make things worse in the long term. We actually make it a worse world for these people. We make it a worse world for these organizations. We don't help the victims. We don't stop the terrorism groups. We don't stop the terror or the genocide from happening. We simply take out one person who we have all collectively magically agreed is guilty, which we don't think happens. So really there's no efficacy. There's no long-term solutions. And because of these egregious policies happening, because we do not see that we make anything better, we actually think we make it 10 times worse. Me and Calvin are proud to oppose, because honestly, I don't want to live in a world where we can't really know, but we're going to just go kill people because we assume that they're guilty without any due process of justice. Thank you.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her speech, and now calls upon the Member of Government to extend the debate for Government Bench.
Here, here.
Timekeeper? Timekeeper? Okay. Do my best, but I might need to look at you. Okay. Who is the chair? Also, oh. Well, sorry, guys.
Where's your beard?
Thanks. I'm somewhat noticed. Okay, so I have a lot of stuff to do. As the back half of the government bench, I have a lot of argumentation that I think is critical to this particular debate round. But at the same time, I think we did get some lines of analysis from my front half which are absolutely really critical to this discussion, specifically when I talk about the nature of justice. I think the victims of these particular crimes we're talking about are paramount, and more importantly, I think the failures of the ICC are also critical, because in my head, regardless of what you may have thought of that model, I realized to myself, that's still a lot better than the existing infrastructure we have in the ICC. So I'm still quite happy to support this as an alternative. Yeah, okay, so here's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk specifically about the nature of crimes against humanity, the nature of guilt. I don't buy the front half's interpretation that, well, we need courts to figure out guilt. That's ridiculous and counterintuitive given the specifics of this resolution. Second, I want to talk about the nature of this assassination. Why assassination in particular? I have a dense amount of analysis about that. And then lastly, I want to talk about the victims. I want to bring in real case studies of instances where this is factually the case. I want to talk about Rios Monte, former dictator of Guatemala. I was just there for a while. I learned a tremendous amount of horrifying and tragic facts about the nature of a people trapped within a dictatorship and the nature of a response from the international community that has been subpar and far, far more devastating than any other response could have possibly been fathomed. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of crimes against humanity. We get this up and down the bench, which is odd. They're like, well, we need the courts to figure out who's guilty. That's not the case at all when we're specifically talking about crimes against humanity. There is absolute consensus about the nature of these crimes and who is responsible. And even if you're not the one who pulled the trigger, the necessary position you are in as a leader, as a political leader within these nations, makes it that you are guilty regardless of your direct actions. That level of incompetence and neglect for your state necessarily facilitates a justification for you to die. Because if you allow this level of atrocity within your borders, we think obviously you're in some way facilitating it, obviously. But more importantly, we don't even care if you're not. Because the level of atrocity that you're allowing passively justifies what we're discussing here. So this notion that, well, you know, even some people deny the Holocaust, but as we've already heard, that's purely for political reasons. It's not because anyone purely denies it. It's only because the existing infrastructure prevents for more action to occur.
So let's actually look at the Holocaust a little bit. Let's look at the Eichmann trial, which was independent of the ICC and tremendously successful because it actually formed a pathway to restoration for the people of Israel. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but it entirely negates what we heard from the front half about, oh, you know, sometimes you don't really know, sometimes it's hard to do stuff. That's ridiculous. So I'm going to get into this thing about positions of power and liability. This is another thing that directly engages with what we heard of, right? We're necessarily toppling a machine of oppression. Even if this guy, as an individual, or madame, I guess, right? Never happened before, but could. Anyways, even if we topple them, the amount of destruction we're going to do to this machine of oppression through a power vacuum is good. If we actually disrupt this system where functioning perfectly fine results in genocide, I want to throw a wrench in that. I want to throw a wrench in that. A lot, actually. So that's cool. Now, I'm going to get into this nature of why assassination, because we have a really interesting interpretation to assassination. Back half.
Okay, so if you just assassinate people, and if they're not the actual leaders of these genocides, you're never actually able to discover who the actual leader is because you're killing all the people who know who it is. You're killing your informants.
I think when we're dealing with crimes against humanity, there's never a shortage of informants that can attest to the nature of these crimes. Thanks. Let's talk about assassination. It's not that we think we're going to do retribution for them because they're bad people. We can't. They've committed crimes against humanity. There's nothing we could do. They would need to spend both of their speeches constructing a fabulous idea of how we're going to torture them to come even close to genuine retribution. Rather, we think assassination specifically is the best means to justice insofar as it leads to restoration rather than retribution. Because when we're talking specifically about crimes against humanity, almost every other pillar of justice doesn't apply. Right? What we can do is a sense of restoration for the victims that have been directly affected. So, here's what I think about that specifically. Let's talk about Rios Monte, right? When we're dealing with a group of people that have been directly affected on mass scale, most of them aren't going to be happy, shouldn't be happy, unless they can walk away from the past. If the past constantly goes on their TV, if they constantly know that victims die before these people see any form of justice, there is no justice, there is no peace, there is no restoration within these nations or within the people directly affected by that. We need to kill them, not because they're bad and they deserve to die, but that's the only means to move on. That's the only means for the psychology of an entire people to move on past the point of blunt force trauma so that it can see a next step. Back half again.
Again, those people can get that reconciliation if they can't go to trial and provide testimonies that announce to the world how much suffering they ran through the dictator. Bullets don't tell stories, but trials do.
Okay, reconciliatory structures after the fact allow people to testify. A legal framework of courts is the worst platform to tell your story, to tell your suffering, and to tell the stories of your grandmother and what she was about. Having to legally lay out guilt is not the best way to express yourself and pass through that point. That's the wrong structure for what you're going for, but we agree that that's a necessary component of this particular debate. So when we're talking about existing systems and justice, the most important actor to illustrate here is the victims of these crimes. When we look at Rios Monte, even if we look so far back as Kosovo, you necessarily have instances of begrudging towards the international community, and we advocate for a system, as has been proposed here, where we cut it down. So that it's a blank veil of shady characters, because we don't want a face behind this. And we advocate for other systems that don't say, we're the international community and I think this is the solution. All right, carry on then. No, we think that's ridiculous. The best method to absolutely create a form of restoration is to have a system where we unanimously recognize that the atrocities that have occurred to your people deserve a means that you can pass on, deserve a form of restoration so that it's real justice. Because front half says, oh, people would rather you rot in a jail, and the Hodge is the best place to rot, right? You're literally held up in a penthouse for the rest of your life, living much better than 98% of the population that's left in your nation. So for all of these reasons, and given my burden, I would like to propose.
We thank the member of government for his speech and now call upon the member of the opposition to extend the debate for opposition bench. Here.
Madam Speaker, both teams on the government bench are essentially promoting a system of anarchy. Fundamentally, on side opposition, we believe that anarchy is worse for people than ordered societies that have systems of justice that are reliably followed. That's the basic line that our extension is going to follow today. But first of all, I want to talk about a lot of refutation. So on the front half, largely we see this idea that strategically, less crimes will occur if you kill the people who are committing those crimes. First of all, as opposition already told you, we don't actually think that's true. We think that power vacuums will be filled. We think that structural problems that create violent societies will continue. We believe that neighboring countries who are already interveners in conflicts are likely to intervene more if they see more chaotic situations and more opportunities for them to intervene. All of this kind of violence doesn't just come from one person. It comes from structures within society. And the violence is also done not by just one person, but by a large group of complicit people within that society. And we believe fundamentally that you're promoting an anarchic system that will be more violent by doing these assassinations. But beyond the strategic point, like as I'm going to discuss in my extension, we believe that this is contrary to the idea of crimes against humanity or justice itself. So like all their points about how this is some kind of deterrence, you can't have deterrence if you don't predictably know what the consequences are of your actions. This is kind of the point of a system of justice, is that it has predictable consequences for people. Even if all that we have is a budding system of justice that is currently imperfect, we would prefer that to an anarchic system where people can't predictably figure out what's going to happen to them. Because like, as much as they'd like to hand wave all of this, people will still perceive and interpret that there are decision makers behind the scenes who are deciding to kill people. It will be perceived as some kind of imperialism, whether Western or not, and it will be perceived as an intervention that will lead to more violence afterwards. And then on the back half, largely we get very similar points about how victims deserve justice and this is somehow justice, right? So in terms of that point, first of all, the distribution of guilt for these crimes is much more complicated than they would have you believe. So killing the top leader or the top couple of leaders who are prominent in this society doesn't give justice to someone who was killed by their neighbor because it was like a genocide perpetrated against them, right? They did not get justice because the person who directly perpetrated that against them was not brought to trial. Maybe we can do that later, but the problem with killing the leaders is that you preempt that society's ability to actually come to terms with what happened themselves. So furthermore, we think that you get rid of the opportunity to actually have a full process of justice that finds out what actually happened, right? So part of the point of systems of justice is to determine what happened, and in order to do so, you have to have the relevant actors present. And it is that society's right to have that happen in some way fully. So now I just want to get onto our extension. I'll take front half.
Yeah, okay, so that current system exists in the ICC already, right? Like, we know that we can't necessarily take those 200,000 Rwandans and try them in the ICC.
Okay, but we can have, full processes of reconciliation that are driven by both the international community and those societies that are not preempted by a shadowy group of people who'd like to take it into their own hands. That fundamentally undermines that system, because then you give the right to decide to the shadowy group of assassinators rather than to the system of justice. So then the question of now are we going to have some kind of process that's or why didn't we just assassinate them, right? It's sort of an odd thing to do in terms of justice. But I'm going to get on to my extension. So the front half mostly talked about strategically, is this a good idea? And I think it's fairly clear that it's not. What I want to talk about is why, even if you prevent more crimes from occurring by this specific person, you should still fall on our side in terms of promoting systems of justice and why that's important. First of all, domestically. We think that fundamentally the victims of these crimes are ill-served by this system. Why? The idea of justice itself is grounded in serving those people, right? So as societies, as an international society, for example, we've decided that crimes against humanity are unacceptable. We've done so all together, in an open process, with all countries basically agreeing that those crimes are unacceptable. So it is now not acceptable for a small group of people to take that definition and exert justice willy-nilly. What naturally needs to happen is we need to get together and decide as an international society, which we think is desirable, how we're going to enact justice together. So by doing this kind of assassination system, you entirely preempt that system from ever coming about, and we think that that's a really negative thing. In terms of the victims of those crimes domestically, you preempt the ability, in some cases, to find the rest of the perpetrators of those crimes. You prevent the victims from having having a stake in prosecution and in justice, which we think is really important. So we think it's important for victims' voices to be included in prosecutions. And in this case, if you have those prosecutions in a black court, that will obviously never happen. Furthermore, we believe that you preempt the ability to find out the structural problems in that society so that they don't happen again, right? So a violence is done against this society by this person. We believe that it's that society's right, and this is instilled within the system of the ICC, to participate in that process afterwards. So when the ICC decides to carry out a trial, first they look to domestic systems, and they ask themselves, are those systems sufficient? Are those systems serving those people? And they only act if that is not true. And all of this process is accountable to everyone in the world and is well understood by everyone. I'll take you in a moment. So through doing so, through privileging domestic systems, you make sure that justice within those societies are actually serving the people who have a stake in that justice. Go ahead.
Because we're both burdened to talk about systems that target individuals, most of your analysis about the distribution of blame fits outside of this debate.
Okay, I didn't understand that QI at all. But first of all, killing the people and deciding that you're going to have your own system of justice fundamentally undermines any budding system of justice, and that's the problem. So on to my second point, is internationally, right? So the idea of a crime against humanity is premised on the idea that there can be a system of justice to address that crime, right? If it wasn't like that, then it would be a matter of opinion what a crime of humanity is. If it is unilateral, then it is just a matter of opinion of those people. It is not actually a crime against humanity. It's something that they think is wrong. What actually matters is the idea that as an international community, we have decided that there is such thing as a crime against humanity, that there's such thing as global human interests, and those interests are naturally and obviously served by having a system that can promote international justice. That is necessary in order to not have an anarchic society that's dangerous for the people in it, which is what we're trying to move away from now by creating things like the ICC. Perhaps if we cared about international justice, the US should actually sign on to the ICC and act within it, and that would be much more productive. So the actual idea of having a crime against humanity is necessarily better served by promoting a system of international justice, and this fundamentally undermines that, because it preempts it with a system of assassinations, which fundamentally just isn't going to work. So because we believe in promoting a system of international justice, because we believe that best serves everyone in the world, we are proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition for her speech and now call upon the government whip to summarize the debate for his team and his bench. Hear, hear.
So most of my analysis and engagement with side opposition is going to be through my 3 questions, but some of them don't fit in perfectly well, so I'm just going to engage with them right away at the start. Number 1, there's this notion that you're promoting anarchy, and I just want to engage with the possible options that we have in existence, right? So say we do have some sort of atrocity going out there. We know of this. We're seeing people dying. What do? We have 2 options. Either we don't go in and just let it, die out. We're not in support of that. We're not going to wait for it to wait for this dictator to run out of people to kill. We're going to go in. And what happens when you go in? Their option suggests that we go in, we arrest this individual, and then have him held up for trial. When you remove that person from that society, whether it's by taking him out and putting him in a hotel in New York, or you take him out by killing him, you're still creating those hydras they're talking about. You're still creating those power vacuums they're talking about. Those things still exist. So it's fundamentally the same. So their only analysis possible is just let it die out. That's not acceptable at all. We're not going to let people die out. Number 2. They say that you can't find out anything without a trial. This is beyond ridiculous, right? It's all of the academics in the world will slowly die out. If we don't have a trial, we won't be able to interview these people. We'll not be able to talk to them because the legal mechanism is the sole area in which you can have discourse and engagement. My partner specifically showed you why that's not true. When you take these people and bring them in court and tell you, explain your experience, and they start talking and say, no, don't frame it like that. Objection. You need to frame it in a neutral ground. This is the legal procedures. You're not letting them engage. You're not letting them talk. If you want these people to have their voice, then give them their voice. Interview them. talk to them and bring their message out to whatever platform you want. You don't need a legal mechanism or an international court to do that very action. That analysis is beyond ridiculous. Finally, they said that you can't stop all the actors. That's not an argument. That's just pragmatic reality. Obviously, we can't take on everybody who's like responsible for a genocide. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to take out some of the actors. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take out like the principal and like main actors, right? Like we should still make some sort of effort to engage with this horrible atrocity. Okay. My 3 questions are going to show you why it is that second government specifically deserves to win this round. And the reason why is that we've most thoroughly engaged with the resolution itself. We want to show you what crime against humanity are. Like, why are these crimes so specifically unique? We want to talk to you about number 2, why do we want to assassinate specifically? Why that's so important rather than any other means? We're specifically unique in doing that. And thirdly, I want to talk about these values and ideals. Because essentially, all of opposition is just, it's okay for us to let people die so long as we can just have this intellectual circle jerk about how it's really important to have international norms of values, how we engage with one another, and how we have in an abstract sense, a notion of international justice. That's all good. But we think it's better to save lives. We think it's better to have proper justice and have people responsible. I'm all for that second part. I'm not going to repeat it again. But we think that justice is more important. Calvin, sure.
In Rwanda, there was a genocide. All
True.
that happened afterwards was that power structures change, which is all you accomplish with assassination. The hatred and the tensions remain. All you do is allow for future crimes against humanity, future genocides to happen, because you don't solve for any of that.
Okay, but how does that not agree with your alternative, the existing model, where you remove dictators and then have them on trial, right? Okay, so I know their model wasn't brilliant, but their assumption is that because we don't have a legal trial, we're not going to ever do anything again. We're just going to send out random guys with guns and shoot people, right? We're still going to think about it, conceptualize it. We're still going to have the United Nations involved as they modeled it. They're going to talk about what are the repercussions of assassination. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. This is not complicated, right? They modeled it. Their specific model was really well. It was, we're only going to do it if it's blatantly obvious. I guess that means we're going to think about it first. Okay, so what are the questions I want to ask in this round? Number 1, why are crimes against humanity specifically unique? Okay, they're specifically unique at this time because the existing structures of law simply don't have the means to address them. When I go on trial, for example, if I stab someone, they first check, why did I stab someone? Was there harm? And then out of that determine from the existing possibilities of punishments, which one they give. He did this for this reason. He did it because he was starving or something, so we're going to give him a lower sentence. He did it because he's a sociopath, we're going to give him a higher sentence. You have that discussion. What's the point of having this discussion when no existing punishment could possibly actually punish the individual you're holding up to, right? There's no possible punishment. You can't actually go out and torture this person for the next 80 years. We don't have that framework. All you can possibly do, the best thing you can possibly do under their framework is to put him up in a really nice hotel in New York for about 20 years and then have him put to death or have the remainder of his life. We'd rather not have him have that posh lifestyle for 20 years. We'd rather have him live in fear for the next 6 months of being assassinated and finally then be assassinated. It's over. That's why these crimes against humanity are fundamentally unique, because existing structures don't engage with them. Sure, Allison.
Okay, the budding international standard and norm in cases of genocide is not to do nothing. It's to intervene in those societies, but then having done so, then you can bring people to justice afterwards. It's not to randomly
right,
assassinate.
But again, it's the same ridiculous argumentation. Once we assassinate guys, it's impossible to intervene in societies. We can't talk to people. We can't intervene in any possible way. This is really stupid. All their arguments are based on the assumption that once a leader is politically assassinated, it's physiologically impossible for you to intervene in that country in any possible meaningful way. That's beyond dumb. Okay, number 2, why do we want to assassinate? Okay, this is particularly important. We want to assassinate because that's the only way you get proper, a cathartic release for the people there. We gave the example of Rios Monte, right? These people need that release. They don't want to see that trial going on and on. They don't want to see my neighbor who was slashed because of this politician with a machete just died tonight. but that guy's still in that hotel with better healthcare, with a better life. I want it to be over, and I want it to be over now. I need that release. And you only give that release when you recognize that this was a disgusting thing and it needs to be taken care of. You only get that cathartic release when you take that individual out. Number 3, are ideals actually that valuable? We have 2 things. On-site Allison, Vitor, we want to have this like broad framework of where the UN can sort of go around and pat each other on the back and say, guys, did we uphold national norms of justice today? Did we like conceptualize justice in the proper political science framework? Yeah, we did. That was pretty cool. Are those guys still dying? Well, yeah, but like academically and conceptually, it's like really well developed, right? So like that's cool. Like that's really dumb. We think that we should actually care about what's happening. These individuals are dying. You need to protect them. You need to engage with these issues and stop talking about them in this ridiculous broader academic context. You need action. These people deserve action, and you're denying them this by not acting. For those reasons, we beg to propose. Thank you.
We thank the government whip for his speech and now call upon the opposition whip to summarize the debate for his team, his bench, and the debate proper. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Alright, can I begin? Alright, so we do agree that the ICC isn't perfect right now, but we don't think that the solution to bettering justice in the international stage is not to abandon the ICC and instead spend all of our political will and our magical government fiat to create the UN version of Batman. We think that the better use of that magic is to better the ICC, right? Is to do concrete things to ensure that we actually intervene in genocides, to make sure that we actually put positive efforts to bring them to justice, right? Not be racist, not be just focusing on a few specific people, right? We think that we can focus our efforts in much better ways than trying to assassinate someone and then failing miserably for 10 years like we did for Osama bin Laden, Fidel Castro, and pretty much anyone else that we actually tried to assassinate, right? So 2 main questions in the round today. 1, what is the most effective way in seizing conflict in the present for that genocide? And secondly, how do we create lasting peace and reconciliation and avoid a repeat of said genocide? So first, how do we get best effectiveness? Basically, up and down the benches inside government, they have this belief that as soon as you assassinate a leader, that is going to be okay, guys. We threw a wrench and now it's all screwed up. They can't move that car anymore. What they fail to recognize is that they're capable people. They can grab that wrench and use that assassination attempt to grease their system, and they're like and being emboldened by it, right? As we explained on side opposition, especially on the back half, that like the reason why genocide exists isn't because there was one really evil man or madam, I guess, that convinced everyone else to follow their crazy cult of personality. Genocide happens because of structural problems where people are actually racist, where people actually hate the other ethnic group or whatever other reason, right? So when you kill the leader, you don't kill these structural problems, right? Instead, what you get is you get that power vacuum where you get to neighboring countries, as my partner mentioned, but also like different factions within the system to try to seize power and do even worse things, right? So you don't solve the structural problem. The problem doesn't come from the leader, it comes from the system. Josue.
Okay, so the consequences of a failed assassination attempt are identical to the consequences of a failed trial, which often happens.
Yeah, if you fail, then you fail, I guess. Like, same thing. But instead of wasting money trying to create an entire new system, maybe we should use that money and improve that system that is currently failing and could be done better, right? I think that's way more effective. I don't think you can make an argument that if we both fail, then we both fail. Like, that doesn't make sense. Second reason why we don't think this is going to be effective in seizing conflict. Again, when you do intervene and you do try to bring people to trial, you discover the additional crimes that happen, right? Oftentimes you have very superficial understanding of what is happening on that country, right? It's really difficult to get information out when the government or oppressors are killing everyone who tried to leave the country, right? Information is very restricted when there is genocide. So the only way to get that information is to intervene, is to get people in justice. So how do we get like lasting peace and reconciliation? we get lasting peace and reconciliation by actually including victims in the process. It's not an intellectual circle jerk to have an international court, right? It's to include victims in the process so they actually have a way for them to express the atrocities that they went through, right? And like a late night special after you kill the leader isn't going to have nearly the same effect of an international trial that where everyone is watching because you actually have a high profile leader in that trial, right? Trials are way more likely to be watched when you have someone who is famous for doing something terrible than just the victims without like the star player. Umer.
Okay, I think it's better for you to have like, the UN go out and say, we're going to have a major event, we're going to have all these speakers come out, we're going to have like people discuss this event in an open environment, rather than cross-examination from like all these like horrible like atrocities, which is extremely traumatic.
I think that we will be cross-examining the people who actually did the atrocities versus the victims. The victims are there to provide their testimonies and provide the atrocities that happened to them, right? I don't think that, yeah. So, moving on. So how do we get actual lasting peace? You get lasting peace through reconciliation, right? When you have these trial systems and you're able to espouse the failures of the ideologies that brought the genocide, you're able to actually fix that problem in the future, right? Because recognize that you can't kill ideologies with bullets. When you kill the leader, the people underneath are still going to be leaving those atrocities, and we think that's hugely problematic. But furthermore, by the way that you get lasting peace and reconciliation is by getting an agreement as to what humanitarian crimes and what international justice means, right? You can't have a black court saying, this is what we think is what an international crime is. We're not going to tell you because we're like a secret court, but we're still going to be carrying out that assassination anyway. It's obvious that it's going to be seen as a Western intervention. It's obvious that it's going to be seen as a unilateral attempt that is going to completely be ignoring the wills of the victims, which we think is incredibly problematic. But also recognize that the justice that they're getting is very shallow, right? You're only killing the face of the movement. You're not killing the people who are like prosecuting the people who actually committed the harm. When you are a person who is suffering from genocide or oppression, you're not being personally persecuted by Kony himself or Slobodan Milosevic himself coming to your house and harming you. No, it's your neighbor, it's the officers, or the lower ranked people who actually harmed you in person. And the only way to get meaningful justice in this situation is not by killing the head of state. It's by prosecuting the entire systematic apparatus that provided this oppression. And the only way that you can meaningfully get to that system is by providing this international court of justice that can bring all of these people to trial, right? By assassinating and being, whoops, job's done, you're not actually going to get there, right? You're not going to get that political will. Already got 2 POIs, you don't have to exercise anymore. So, again, at the end of the day, how do you get that everlasting peace that we so strive to attain? You need international development and getting the concept of hold on, I have very bad writing right now, so I'm just going to jump to rebuttals that I haven't done so far because it didn't really fit in the round. So what did we hear from First Government, which I would like to call Team Clint Eastwood? Basically, they come up here and literally said that we're going to do cowboy politics. This is now the Wild West, guys. We're just going to shoot people that we don't like. Recognize that we are in the West right now and we're not shooting people anymore because we recognize that having a system of justice is preferable than shooting people on their temple. So it's pretty obvious that from the fact that we are not in the Wild West anymore, that their ideas kind of suck. And I guess it was a pretty good rebuttal already from First Gov. So let's address Second Gov, lastly, which I would call fast food justice. Basically, they would like the quick solution. But as we provided to you an extensive analysis, that a quick solution isn't the good solution, right? It's not effective, they haven't proved effectiveness, but also the victims won't receive the reconciliation and all the things that they actually need. So for these reasons, we are proud to vote.